why wouldn't they click? If something looks so realistic, despite all of the awareness going, it just takes that one little incident. And I think what needs to happen is people to be encouraged to put their hand up rather than kind of being told off.
The phone is the single weakest point I now have, because if I compromise the phone, I've got pretty much everything.
That somewhere in the region of about only 2% of ransomware attacks will actually succeed if they're caught in the early stages.
What is AI? You know, you hear it every day and it's being pushed out by vendors, and we hear the stories about the bad guys using AI.
Although we're talking about 2024 trends, a lot of these trends are just continuations of the status quo. Hey folks, welcome to ThreatCast, a new podcast that Threatscape, where we're going to be discussing everything cybersecurity with guest, expert interviews, industry analysis, and basically everything to do with keeping your IT secure. So I'm Ru Campbell. I'm a Microsoft MVP in security, and I at Threatscape head up the Microsoft professional services practice. I mostly specialize in Microsoft Defender XDR, Microsoft Purview, Microsoft Intune, all that kind of good cloud security stuff with a little bit of on-prem Active Directory as well. I also have a book. I got to get that plug in, right? It's called Mastering Microsoft 365 Defender, which of course, as soon as I released it, they changed the product name. So I got that going for me. And I also run a monthly user group that's all to do with Microsoft 365 security. It's not just myself though. I'm joined by two of my esteemed colleagues from Threatscape. Colin, do you want to introduce yourself?
I will. Hi, Ru. Hi, guys. Colin Reid is my name. I'm Commercial Director here at Threatscape. I've been here since day one. I've been in the sector for 20 plus years. I had dark hair back then, and now it's gone white. We've seen some transition over the last 20 years, and it's a lifetime in this sector is 6 months, in my view. My role here at Threatscape is working with a couple of key customers. Also vendor relationships. I work very closely with Microsoft and a couple of other partners, and I work very closely with our UK sales director on the UK market development.
Good stuff. Cheers, Colin. And you've gone from a black hat to a white hat just through your time in cybersecurity. I love it. So, and Paul, do you want to introduce yourself as well, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Paul O'Sullivan. I'm the UK sales director at Threatscape. Like Colin, I've been around the industry for a long time, but I look all the better for it. Set out in the early days of the internet provider world, as it were, with firewalls, really Checkpoint on Nokia appliances, and then stumbled into the early days of message labs and saw the explosion of email security. And then been around a few other organisations since, vendor and reseller side. So, like Colin, seen this evolution over time. Primary responsibility is to look after the UK customers and the UK team, and to ensure they're happy and we give them the right solutions in a timely manner.
Awesome. Good stuff. So cheers.
I just the black and white thing, Ruth, the black hat, white hat. Sorry, it took a minute to filter through.
That's okay. It's it happens, right? You've been in this a long time. So I guess today we were going to focus on talking about, the trends that we're seeing thus far in 2024, and as we're kind of forecasting throughout the rest of the year. So the trends in cybersecurity. So I'll tell you what, Colin, you're a man of wisdom. How about you kick us off with talking about what's one of the main things that customers are asking you about and inquiring about?
We can't avoid the AI. We just can't avoid it. And I kind of always go, well, what is AI? You hear it every day, and it's being pushed out by vendors, and we hear the stories about the bad guys using AI. Look, AI to me is, and I'm going to throw it out for you guys as well, but AI to me is like, it's big data. It's big data models, and it's just how can we use it smartly to make decisions for us and kind of automate the banal and give us a little bit more productivity capacity. That's in the ideal world. But we do know that the cyber criminals are using the AI to speed up their attacks and create more complex attacks. And I guess it's trying to understand, what are the powers of AI? And people say, it's limitless. And I go, well, maybe, but ultimately it's a computer making a decision. And I remember being at WebEx in 2019, just before COVID. And Sophie the robot came on stage, and I cannot remember, they introduced a second robot. and it was scary because they were having a full-blown conversation and they were only short of showing emotion. That was my first real introduction into real AI. And maybe that's just my interpretation, but I just see it as another evolution of the big data that we've had for 20 plus years, and we're just applying some kind of smart models to it. And that's where I'm at. But I'm going to throw it out. Paul, what are your views? Ru, Paul, what are your thoughts on it?
I think it's what you said. I think it's automation across a massive data set. Yeah, I think, number one, there's a lot of hype about it, like there is with everything else. So everybody's jumping on the bandwagon, and it's like it's the silver bullet for everything. Number two, there's this perception, or the seeming perception, that it's going to be sentient or it's going to have consciousness. Great, of course it's not. To my mind, all it's going to do is going to give people the ability to scale. And we see it, just for an example, we see it in the sales world. So anybody who's been on LinkedIn will see me getting grumpy about terrible salespeople, terrible outreach, finding stuff out there that's completely meaningless.
You get grumpy?
Yeah, well, that's an example of using technology badly. And you look at some of these things, you look at some of the answers on LinkedIn Expert, for example, they've obviously been using AI to create the answer. So there's a whiff about it. So to my mind, it's a tool, as simple as that. It gives scale. If done intelligently, as we expect the malicious attacks to do, it creates a problem. But we're not going to wake up one morning and the bombs are going to fall, and the T-1000 or whatever are going to start chasing us around in the hunter killers. I think
RoboCop Part 5.
That would be fun, though, if things did get a little Terminator 2-ish. That would, I guess, I totally agree with you, Paul, insofar as Microsoft just published a report the other week where, they were been monitoring threat actors, like I think North Korea came into it, Lazarus, where what you're seeing them using AI tools for is really just to help them be more productive with the existing tools, right? So they're using AI to research phishing targets, to help compose phishing emails, stuff like that, right? And there is a lot of hype, usually from folks that aren't deep in the trenches of actually dealing with these threats, right? So, it's quite easy to watch the news. You see the big scare stories, AI is going to, pose massive cybersecurity risks. But then when you actually talk to folks who are dealing with it day in, day out, the risks aren't particularly new. They're just being used as a tool to achieve those same old objectives, right? And I guess one of the things that is at least comforting for now, based on the report that Microsoft just published, actually, there wasn't really any evidence of AI generating malware from scratch, right? It's just about giving the bad actors easy insight into research and things like that. That said, like any other piece of technology, it's like, look, we're right at the beginning of this thing. You know what I mean? So we cannot make too many assumptions because, well, the reality is we wouldn't have been having this conversation 2 years ago, right? Who knows what's going to be around the corner.
But what about, the vendors? So the big security vendors are all bringing AI into their tech stack. And maybe I'm misinterpreting it. My view is that they're just bringing in smart automation. But I suppose it's reacting to the idea behind AI is, it's not like a playbook. It's like, well, we're reacting to a scenario based on the data that we have. And that data is constantly changing and being updated. So there are clear benefits to having AI, but it's also, there's a risk because if you bring AI into your environment, and we've seen it, I'm not going to call out the vendor, but we've seen where there could be data leaks. So you've got to have, if you're going to bring AI into your workspace, you've got to have pretty strong DLP processes and policies in place. Would you agree with that?
Yep. Yeah, I certainly would. It's like, without getting into names and things like that, a lot of the AI tools that are out there, they're almost just like they're just like a user interface over all your data that's already there. So, well, let's just call it out. If you're implementing something like Copilot for Microsoft 365, that's just going to surface all the stuff that you've already got permission for, maybe incorrectly, right? So you might ask it something and it tells you an answer that you really weren't supposed to find out. So again, doing the basics would kind of help mitigate that problem.
Yeah, it's done that. As you know, I sponsor a chat group with a bunch of CISOs and senior SecOps people, and that was kind of bounced around about with the Copilot example. And I see the problem coming where if people haven't given a lot of thought and consideration to the controls they've got in place, then the machine can just simply go across all of the data and slurp it all and potentially present sensitive stuff to people who shouldn't have access and so forth. So again, it just like cloud, it will. You have a bad day really quickly if you haven't sat back and thought about how you're going to actually architect and build something.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that, Paul. Yeah.
And I guess, so speaking of having a bad day, I'm going to shift over to talking about one of the trends that we're still seeing is ransomware, right? It's really the first point of discussion that comes up when I'm talking with so many of my customers, because in terms of prioritizing what's in the news, what we're scared of, what do we want to avoid? Well, ransomware is that complete disaster scenario. And there's obviously in the news recently been some good progress by law enforcement with regards to reining in some of the ransomware gangs. That's really encouraging to see. But as one gets squashed, others pop up, and there's this massive ecosystem that ain't going away overnight. You're going to see the bad guys kind of leverage AI in terms of getting initial access and things like that, right? But I guess just to kind of remind folks that although we're talking about 2024 trends, a lot of these trends are just continuations of the status quo.
Yeah, I go back to what they call the wiper attacks. Hermetic Wiper was one that hit Ukraine just almost 2 years ago, the start of the war. It hit some large organizations in the Ukraine. And I guess that's kind of that was masqueraded as ransomware. But we actually had an organization here hit recently. And I suppose it's how does it get in? Like, we all know ransomware was there, that it's a business now, that's a given. Organizations unfortunately paid the ransoms, but commercially when you look at it, I'm going to be offline for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, it's going to cost me X millions. Or I can pay the guys $500,000 in the hope I'm going to get the decryption key. There seems to be some honor amongst thieves in the cybercrime world, but you've no guarantee it's going to come back. And always, when you do a tabletop exercise, and we did one recently, it's like, do you pay? Do you not pay? What is the risk if you don't pay? What's the risk if you do pay? And there's no right or wrong answer, unfortunately, when you're up against this. But it's how does it get in the first place? And we're still seeing, I was reading the report out by Google, Palo Alto's Unit 42 had a report out, and the Microsoft security report, and PDFs, number one source, coming in via email, obviously, and the ingredients to bake the cake are being dropped in, not being picked up, and then they're put together, and boom. So a lot of it is around what practices can be put in place to prevent this, but ultimately it's that user. I always say the problem's been sharing the keyboard, clicking on the goddamn link. But it is so prevalent, and it's not going away. So we have to be very, very aware of that and talk to our customers about it and give them easier solutions to stop this from happening.
Yep. Yeah, it's a good point. And for example, we know that, you talk about stopping it from happening. We know from last year's Microsoft Digital Defense report that somewhere in the region of about only 2% of ransomware attacks will actually succeed if they're caught in the early stages, right? So in my mind, it's kind of like reducing that time to respond by getting the right tools in place, also by slowing the attacker down and raising the cost. And it kind of reminds me, there's that show, probably going to butcher the name of this, but it's that show, I think it's called The First 48, and it's about how if someone is kidnapped, that first 48 hours, that's your key window, and then beyond those first 48 hours, it becomes almost impossible to do anything about it. Really, the case with ransomware incidents as well is identifying it right at the start, because what you're seeing is most ransomware incidents now, from my understanding, they use remote encryption, where they'll exfiltrate the data, encrypt it, and then send it back. And that's that's not possible to detect, but it's much harder to detect from out the box EDRs and SIEMs and all the rest of it. And I guess, to your point, Colin, you mentioned email, i.e. PDF lands. That's the initial point of attack. At the risk of getting into the point where you're kind of blaming the user, because there is stuff that, IT teams can do to harden that. It brings you down to that other trend, right, of, business email compromise. And it's easy to overlook because it's not the new shiny thing. But I know, Paul, you've been in this game for an awful long time dealing with email gateways and stuff like that, and you're still hearing customers talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, just on that, if you look back over email, it is the de facto core business application for everybody, regardless, whether you're in engineering, banking, legal, all of them. Everybody relies on email. It's absolutely ingrained. The thing that's always stunned me is how people kind of, in my opinion, go cheap in terms of protecting the email. And what I mean by that is they've kind of bolted on solutions. It was AV scanning originally, like back in the early message lab days. Then they added on the anti-spam, the annoyance. Then it evolved and it went to the whole phishing piece. So you had to add another engine in there to try and explode the content, look at the links, and the links just gone up, all that good stuff. And now it's moved forward yet again with the business email compromise, and that's gas to an extent ransomware, where they're getting cleverer with the attachments to bypass typical EDR, and you can't turn off active content because it kills functionality. Or what they're doing is they're using the social engineering aspect to try and ingratiate themselves and insert themselves, if not with the intended target, but with a third party that supplies the target. So it just keeps moving and moving and moving. And whether that ultimately is because of business email compromise or to deliver ransomware or anything else, it keeps stepping forward and it keeps getting trickier and trickier.
Yep. No,
to address it, but it's a combination of all of the above. And I think, to your comment, Colin, I think we kind of beat up the user, but, why wouldn't they click? If something looks so realistic, despite all of the awareness going, it just takes that one little incident. And I think what needs to happen is people to be encouraged to put their hand up rather than kind of being told off. That will help take things forward over and above the prevention tools.
I think on top of that, if you look at the speed that, ransomware, obviously, look, they want to encrypt and get money, pay the ransom, and you get your data back. But when they're actually stealing the data, we don't know how much they've taken. We can, through forensics, obviously find out, but that will take a bit of time. But the time now between a compromise by the cyber criminals and data exfiltration, that window is really, really reduced. Mm-hmm. And we talk about mean time to detection, mean time to respond, and all that good stuff. But we've got to have capabilities now to protect, detect, and at speed, because it's I think I'm going to say a few years ago it was 232 days or something they landed. Now they're in and out. It's a smash and grab almost. That's how fast it is, and we've got to have the capabilities to do that. And it's not around, I know I was saying the chair and the keyboard and the problems hit between, but it's not just around the humans. I mean, you're right, Ru, the organizations have to take responsibility and really harden that. And to Paul's point around the complexity around BEC now and what they're doing. But it's not just on the inbound. We've got to watch out for outbound as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it's one of the problems that we're seeing a lot of as well is adversaries, they do the reconnaissance, they figure out who's the high profile targets in the organization, and they know the weak spots of the email gateways because it's kind of easy for them to just pick them up, test it, and figure out in their own terms as it's going to get through. And QR code phishing is a big one, right? Because an inbound email gateway, very hard to detect that QR code, especially if you then embed it in a document. You're getting into like OCR and all that type of way to figure it out. So I get my QR code, I scan it, I go and authenticate on a different app. And then to your point, Colin, then about how easy it is to then get lots of data very, very quickly. If you, for example, phish someone with an Office 365 account, well, all of a sudden you've depended on permissions in place, you can do like unrestricted permissions to an entire SharePoint library, OneDrive, email, etc., right? So there's just so much data that are linked to these single sign-on platforms, right? And if you're not doing the right thing to make sure that your users are using phish-proof things like FIDO2 and security keys, or they have to sign in from company devices, etc., it's, the barrier is far lower now, in my opinion, than when we were back in those on-prem days, because I don't have to infiltrate networks and things like that, right? It's just, I get your account, I sign in, boom, all your email, all your OneDrive, all your SharePoint, all your Dropbox, etc.
And that is, I mean, I suppose, the fear of cloud is like how quick and easy it is to compromise lots of different systems. But then there's the ability to put the layers of security in, and that's what is so important. People get confused, I think, in my experience, when you talk about on-prem and cloud and that lift and shift. You cannot lift and shift. It's a completely different. You run a whole world of pain if you try and do something like that. But I think, it's, look, the challenge around it, the email is a lot of people just need to be aware. It goes back to user education as well, is really important. Yes, we've got the tech stack, but we are the weakest link, but we can also be the human firewall. For a long time I spoke about the human firewall, and that's us sitting here at the keyboard. So education is important also.
Yep.
Sorry.
No, on you go, Paul. Let's go.
I say, again, if we sit back and think about it, we talked about AI, we talked about ransomware, we're kind of into business email compromise, but all of this is kind of linked if we think about it, because email is the vector, and yes, you can throw tools and solutions to try and stop the business email compromise or the email vector, as it were, in and of itself. But if we look at ransomware, it's not the entire story. You touched on this identity piece. I mean, you infiltrate an organization, somebody's clicked on something, you embed something probably in the organization, maybe before, rather than just ransomware in the user. You then look to raise privileges, move laterally, and then completely own the organization. There's varying degrees, and depends on whether it's in the service or whether they're zeroed in on them. You look at the different threat actors, and allegedly North Korea, they just farm out and see what they can find, whereas other nation states zero in on specifics. And I think we have to think about these not in isolation, and I think that's been the issue sometimes. Phishing is a problem, let's find a phishing solution. Tick. Whereas there are other ramifications around that we need to consider, and I think the identity is the big one for me, as well as the EDR, maybe stop the ransomware exploding and so on and so forth. And I think sometimes that in and of itself is part of the problem, because we keep sort of ticking the next problem. Attackers don't think like that. They just look for it.
It's such a good point insofar as, the phishing isn't something in and of itself, right? The phishing is the initial access to then achieve further objectives. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like I phish. So for example, I phish your admin so that I can then go and establish some kind of persistence through some embedded application or OAuth app or something like that. Or I phish your finance team so that I can then set up mail flow rules so I can always read their email, stuff like that, right? And you can't just tick the box and say, yeah, we're doing phishing protection. You have to have detections for then what happens after the fact that phishing is successful. And I guess that
the crown jewels, like if you're going the crown jewels route, that's what you're after ultimately. So are they identifying that by reading your emails? They're finding that weakness, and it's so easy for the human being just to succumb when they get, I remember speaking to somebody at an event. Yeah, it was that guy. Boom, click on the link, and it's like no, and it's it's easy. Yeah. It can be too easy.
And on the topic of kind of doing the basics with regards to inbound email protection, the other one that is still a trend is adversaries exploiting vulnerabilities. So it's still we're still seeing that problem of, it's just the nature of the beast, right? It's outdated applications, particularly if they're internet facing. We've seen supply chain compromises of payroll software and things like that over the last year or so, and we're just going to continue playing whack-a-mole, right, with all these different vulnerable apps out there.
Yeah, it's as you say, getting the basics right. We've it sounds easy, but actually patching for vulnerabilities can be a real challenge depending on the environment you're working in, depending on the geographies, the number of sites you have. And we've got a number of customers who, they're scanning for vulnerabilities and they're trying to patch, and it's giving actionable intelligence to local offices, local sites, for example, to say, right, let's look at the critical vulnerabilities. We've got, I'm going to try the number 2,000 vulnerabilities, but guess what? 15 patches here will actually address those 15,000. 2,000. How do we know that? So it's getting that intelligence from the technologies, giving that actionable intelligence to the local people so they can go and do their job. And then, we remember the HSE in Ireland were hit a couple of years ago during COVID, and there was talk about, systems with XP and whatever running on it. But actually, the reason those systems, not all in all cases, but legacy OS has to run on some systems. Otherwise, it's going to cost millions to upgrade the system. So how do you deal with that? And when the bad guys get wind of that, they know there's the weakness. So let's exploit the weakness. And there's more and more of attacks happening by exploiting the weakness. And again, I go back to some of the reports I read recently, and they were saying some of the older stuff, from how did they word it, almost generations ago. You're talking about exploits from 10 years ago, and they're being a bit more pervasive these days. And it's coming back, and the bad guys are taking advantage of that again. So if you think about, okay, if they were there 10 years ago, these vulnerabilities were there 10 years ago, how the hell did we patch them? And if you can't patch, you've got to look at some other way of is it micro-segmentation? Is it, putting a wrapper around an application, particularly say in the OT environment, where it's particularly difficult to patch. And is it, but nonetheless, I always say, if something goes wrong in IT, in terms of attack, you might lose your job. Something goes wrong in OT, someone might die. That's the difference. So, there's a world of pain when you don't patch the vulnerabilities. But you've got to have it where you can't. You've got to have a strategy around that. As I say, micro-segmentation might be one of them. Paul, what do you think?
Well, there's two facets there, isn't there? There's are we able to patch it, are we not? Put some wrapper around it. Okay, yes or no. And oftentimes it's no. Then there's the actual application itself. So I was chatting with a customer we all know, a very large insurer, shall we say, and talk around how struggling to get the logs out of the application so they could actually do something with it and respond. Now, if that application, and in this case, a key application has been written many, many years ago, and the developer or developers have long since taken their the golden handshake and got off into the sunset, forget replatforming for cloud and all that good stuff, that's going to take an age. Right here and now, you've not only got the problem in terms of the potential vulnerability, but you've got the problem in terms of how we know something's going wrong, because we can't develop, finish the logs or the scene, or push logs out to the scene to make sense of it, to address and so forth. So it's kind of there's two elements to that. And I guess therefore not be similar to OT insofar as with OT, you can not only not patch, but you may not get the log information that's needed to be able to make a decision and respond to an attack or something anomalous.
Yep. And one of the things that always strikes me, I seen a kind of debate going on Twitter just a few weeks about this, is the specific definition of vulnerability and how really you kind of need to move away from that mindset that it's all based on out-of-date software with a CVE code attached or something like that, right? Because really a vulnerability is any type of weakness.
Yeah, so, misconfiguration.
100% spot on. Misconfiguration, poor architecture, things like that. That catches folks out as well. And it's one of those things that you can't just throw tools at it. The process itself could be a vulnerability, and you can run scanners and things that will come back, tell you, hey, all this software's out of date, but that's going to miss a lot of the underlying misconfiguration. And I guess to your point, Paul, if you're dealing with that legacy software, it's very easy for folks to say, yeah, just upgrade it. Practically, that's not always an option because there's costs involved. Yeah. There may not be an upgrade path, especially in a lot of these line of business apps. It's maybe developed by something that's now going to the business that developed it is no longer in business. So you're looking at a whole migration. Yeah. And I guess those kind of vulnerabilities are tough.
Yeah, sorry, when you think of a production line, you're producing, I don't know, jars of jam or marmalade. And that's been around for the last 30 years. In the previous world, I worked for an organization that did that. So, that production process, other than trying to improve productivity output, that process is going to be the same. The jam jar comes down, it's blasted with steam, it's filled with jam, the lid's put on, the label's put on, the way it goes. It's kind of A, B, C, D. It's fairly basic. And that's been there for 30 years. But so that doesn't actually need to change. And the application running it doesn't need to change because it's doing its job and it's doing its job effectively. But it's vulnerable. So how do you protect that? And it's vulnerable, I suppose, by design because the design is so old. But the cost of in enhancing that, bringing it up to date could cost millions. And it just doesn't make any financial sense. And then it's running perhaps on legacy OS, which can't be patched. So I go back to, are we putting a wrapper around it? Are we building policy around it? Are we segmenting? What is it there are solutions out there to fix these, but it's putting the time and effort in to understand what can be done. The least painful route, let's say, that's what we want to go down. And it's understanding what those options are. So, they are there. It's just you got to go and explore them.
Yep.
Are we all agreeing that it would suck to be a CISO right now, especially in an OT environment?
Yes, it's always sucked to be a CISO. It's a thankless job.
Yeah. So welcome to our podcast. We're here to cheer everybody up.
That's the nature of the industry, though, isn't it? We're dealing with bad news on a daily basis. And I guess just to then to follow up on the vulnerability thing, and we're talking about how it's not just that this software is maybe a known bad thing about it, right? It's misconfigurations and things. It's the move to the cloud, and identity security is such a big thing now as well. And that's one of the trends that we are seeing is that folks are really realizing that you can't always just throw tools at it and then the tool will take care of it for you. And to me, that's never been clearer than with identity security, where it is all about the process and it is all about the architecture and it is all about the follow through and the monitoring of what's going on in your identity platform. One of the big things I'm dealing with at the minute, we spoke about BEC earlier, it's still phishing, and the fact that they're going to compromise your identities because we've spent the last, 10, 14 years, something like that, trying to get the world to go to, MFA. And then we turn around and we're like, well, actually, MFA isn't enough anymore.
Yeah, because it's like, why bother with MFA? It's like, oh, dear God.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so it is just this it's this loop that we live in, right? And one of the things that will definitely be a trend going into 2024 is the rise of the quote-unquote passkey, right? Where, Android, iOS, and Windows, they all now support this idea of the passkey, which are really... under the hood, it's using 502. But fundamentally what it is, it's certificate-based authentication, and it just happens to be portable, and it's stored in your phone, so that I don't need a password anymore. I can use that certificate that's stored in my phone. And that, in theory, will kind of, squash some of the problems that we see with phishing, man-in-the-middle attacks, things like that. But, and there's always a but, the operational overhead of introducing all these new things. So, the vendors, your Microsofts, your Googles, your Apples, they come up with these solutions, but then there's always going to be this lag in adoption, right? Because internal IT folks, they need to upskill in it, they need to plan to deploy it, and you're at that stage now where you can't just flick a switch and all of a sudden everyone's on the newest, latest, greatest, most secure way of authenticating, right? If MFA proved anything, it's that in the real world, security takes an awful long time, and you can't just say, just enable MFA or just do this, just do that. The real world has a tendency of coming and slapping you in the face and saying, well, actually, there's these whole bunch of roadblocks that you're going to have to overcome.
So just if I'm wearing my CISO hat, two things I've just picked up from what you said there, right? The certificates get stolen. That's what happened ultimately in MFA, if I'm correct. And the phone is the single weakest point I now have, because if I compromise the phone, I've got pretty much everything. But am I right in saying, Ru, so from the identity side of things, there's an awful lot more that can be done, the who, what, where, when, and how of security, and having the processes and policies in place to deal with that. So if my phone is compromised or stolen or whatever, that pretty quickly, we can remediate or prevent something, a compromise, if that happens. Because talking with some CISOs, they, when the whole thing with MFA compromised, and it was like, you could see the eyes going to heaven going, what next? Like, how do we stop this? Where do we? And I know it's an evolving journey, and we always talk about the security maturity journey when we're with customers. But there's a saying of, logging in versus hacking in. If we're making it easier to give the hackers credentials, guess what? They don't have to hack in. They can just log in.
Yes. Yeah.
The identity.
It is. And, with the move to AWS and to Microsoft 365 and Azure and Google Cloud platforms, the reality is these, your big identity providers such as Entra, AWS is their own. There's this kind of centralized point of attack now, right? It used to be all these different Active Directory forests scattered across the world, hidden neatly behind all sorts of different firewalls and things. And it meant that every organization's defenses, I don't want to say they were completely unique in the world, but there'd be some degree of nuance that an adversary would have to figure out and then bypass. If I go all in on something like Microsoft 365, well, if the adversary knows how to, they're skilled up in red teaming attacks on Entra ID, then they can apply that across a whole bunch of different environments, right? So in many ways, we've improved security by moving away from on-prem, insofar as, by providing it as a service, identity platforms can keep that up to date for us. But in many ways, we've also introduced another type of risk, right? Which is that it's by default, you take something like a 365, it's wide open, right? And, that's something that we're going to have to contend with. There's a lot of stuff being done to make things secure by default, but it's still rough out there. You know what I mean? Yeah. You've seen it in January where Microsoft themselves, through a misconfiguration in their identity platform, were subject to a compromise by Midnight Blizzard, which is Russia, right? So it's tough out there, and I don't think it's going to get a lot easier in a hurry.
Well, we've seen an example of that. The poster child for that very situation was a couple of 3 years ago. Paige Thompson, Capital One, AWS, privileges and how they approached it changed. So there's tectonic plates moved underneath. Hey presto, they got access, slurped a load of data, obviously been all over the press and been in the courts for it. But yeah, that was an individual, curious, whatever their motive was, that got along there. So it's going to be no different for the adversaries, and they'll be also as aware of said tectonic plates shifting, the fact that where they once only had a certain degree of access, all of a sudden they can maybe escalate that. And to your point, when it was that nuance of being spread across those forests and across lots of sites, it would have been rather more difficult to figure out how can I move myself around and get to where I need to be. It's in the cloud now, so all of a sudden, those permissions and things change, the config changes, and you're hosed. And
just to follow up on that one, Paul, because we'll try and finish it on like a kind of positive / optimistic note. While it may in some cases be easier for adversaries once they get that initial admin access, because the admin all of a sudden has permission to all sorts of stuff, it is in many cases easier for defenders as well now, right? Because we've got those more tightly integrated response platforms, right? You look at XDR platforms and things like that. They can, if you're doing it right, make it far, far, far quicker to get that visibility and to respond. Yeah. So, absolutely. Hey, trying to be optimistic here. Not easy.
Not all bad. Before we wrap up, I'm conscious that we need to do quickly. One of the things I think for this year is, year of change when you look at the number of people voting, which is estimated at in around 4 billion, roughly 50% of the globe population is going to vote this year. 14 elections in the EU, 64 outside of the EU for either a change in presidency or a change in government. And that's providing a platform for cyber attacks from the big four. And I don't mean the professional services consultancy firms. And to me, it's almost like this is going to provide the F1 platform. So through F1, we got great technologies from cars. Comes down about 5-10 years later, comes down to the car industry for Joe Average to get it. And this year, from a cyber perspective, a cyber attack, I think a lot's going to happen. And we'll see that trickling down over the next few years as to the complexities of all of these cyber attacks. I might be wrong in saying years, because in our world, a year's a lifetime. I mentioned at the start, 6 months. So you've just got to stay vigilant. But there are solutions out there. Absolutely, Ru, I agree with you. And it's not all doom and gloom.
I think for me, it's we've talked about a bunch of trends, and we've talked about them as though they are almost in isolation, which is, I think, how we look at an industry. But, we've talked about AI, ransomware, BC, getting the fundamentals of the basics right, identity. I mean, all of these can join if you look at the whole ransomware discussion, ingress, compromise, escalate privileges, badness spread everywhere. Sometimes it's, to our point, it's not just the process, but it's also elements outside of InfoSec. I mean, where ransomware is concerned, immutable backup tucked away somewhere, as long as it can be restored, because it ain't a backup until you restore it, right? But as long as you can get to that data and get back and up and running, away you go. And we saw the example with Maersk. I mean, luckily they had that AD structure that was an offline system over in Africa, wherever it was, that they flew across and they got back online. I mean, that was a stroke of luck.
Really?
I think people need to look outside of just InfoSec and be thinking about DR, business continuity, as well in this. But more importantly, to my point, looking at the joined upness of some of these approach to these solutions. It's not just a thing in isolation. And I think as an industry, we perhaps really need to start and move away from that thinking. And the vendors need to stop doing it as well.
Nice little kick in at vendors at the end there, Paul. Good man.
Yeah, super right.
We're all nodding positively.
Righty. We should bring this one home. So, listen, Colin, Paul, great to chat with you guys. And for everyone listening, thanks for spending your time with us. If you want to keep up with what we're doing here, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Give us likes if you like what we're doing. Feedback in the comments, that would help as well, so we know what folks want out of the show. And, keep your eyes open and your ears open for us, because we've got some great guests lined up. Paul's going to be chatting with some great CISOs. I'll be talking with some Microsoft security experts. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. Thanks, folks.